And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of stillcurtain.com. Joining me, as always, is Shayne Kubas, contributor for Still Curtain. I was in training camp over the weekend, Shayne. I'm going to share my thoughts on that. Lots of things to note down there. You really get a good insight of being there in person, watching those practices. And so I want to share a lot about my notes and observations from that. We got Steelers football this week, Shayne, and I think everybody is ready for this. Steelers take on the Buccaneers, first preseason game down in Tampa Bay. We're going to talk about what to watch from that game, the things to keep an eye on most. But first, Shayne, as always, let's start off with some of the trending news this week regarding the Pittsburgh Steelers. And this is unfortunate. We're going to talk about Colin Cowherd's shameful comments here for a minute. And for those who don't know what Cowherd said on his show the other day, he was talking about 20 quarterbacks who will never make a Super Bowl. And I don't know how you mess this up, Shayne. I don't know how something like this happens, how it gets through like the graphic team and Cowherd himself. But Dwayne Haskins, the late Dwayne Haskins, was one of the players, one of the 20 quarterbacks you mentioned will never make a Super Bowl. I don't know how this. I just have no words for this, Shayne. It's. I mean, the fact that he didn't know, or at least forgot about Haskins's passing last year. I mean, it's incredible.
So I think for me, the first thing that I think we need to talk about with this is another example, and we've talked about it, I think, a couple times, made comments about it on this show before, and you hear a lot of people talk about it. A lot of the big name, high production sports shows, they don't know as much as you think that they know, right? Like them having that platform doesn't always mean that they're always on the ball, that they know what they're talking about. And, I'm not saying that we know a ton either, that we know everything, but to have a graphic, and this is not just him, this is his entire team, this is the people who put the graphic together, because it's not even just Dwayne Haskins. Like, there's other things, like, why is EJ Manuel in here? He's been out of the league for how long?
Yeah.
Like Bortles. Yeah. Like, this is just a poorly put together segment across the board. And especially having Haskins on here is just inexcusable. But everybody involved with this, it's just another example of why, like, these bigger sports shows, like I said, they tend to get things wrong more than they get them right. And they're really trying to just be entertainment, which is fine. Like, people, that's what it's there for. It's entertainment. It's not really like this hard-hitting news cycle stuff, and that's okay. But this type of stuff is where it really gets into a point where it's not okay, right? It's not just okay now. It's like, it's just an entertainment show. Who cares? This is not the type of stuff you want to have happen on a live show like that, on a show that it's put together. It's a show that should be produced well. They have all the money in the world. They have the talent, and stuff like this still happens. And this is obviously an extreme example of this, but this is, again, just a reminder that those who watch these shows, you're not really getting insight. You're just getting someone who might be good at speaking their mind or, saying crazy things. And you just have to hope that less stuff like this happens, and that I don't expect him to apologize. He hasn't yet. He has not acknowledged it in any way. They've scrubbed the audio on their videos of it that are live right now, like on the YouTube and stuff like that. I think they're kind of just trying to push it away. And it really would not be that hard to just come out and say, hey, our graphic team made a mistake. Colin made a mistake. We didn't address it at the time. This is what happened, whatever. And then it's like, okay, well, you guys made a really huge mistake, but don't do it again, basically. Instead, we probably won't hear anything about it ever again from them, and they will just go on as always and continue to put their show on. So,
yeah, I mean, it's all surface level stuff to begin with, Shayne. It's anytime that you try to cover so many sports and so many teams, you can only go so deep. Yeah, and so I would caution everybody against trying to get your in-depth football information from any of these
sport from them. Yeah.
Yes. I know. And any of these podcast or radio announcers, and they can only go so deep. And this is just more evidence to that. But he's not the only one. I mean, the Stephen A. Smiths out there, all that kind of stuff. I mean, they do the X amount of hot takes and whatever else. Yeah. That's kind of what they're
good at what they do, but it's not what I think.
Yeah, they are. They're good at providing entertainment. They're not as deep as what you think, and it's because they are stretched so thin with what they have to cover. But this is just something that, I mean, we don't want to see a mistake like this again. And it's just it's one of those things that you just don't know how it happens. Because Cowherd's not the only one. It's like somebody put that graphic out there.
Like I said,
he's got somebody in his ear.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it got past that many people, I mean,
It's tough.
Yeah,
It's
just
tough.
just not a great situation all around. All right, let's move on to something a little bit more lighthearted here.
Yes. Yeah. Let's a little
And
bit
that
more.
is Kendrick Green has been playing fullback for the Steelers this past week or so, a couple weeks now, probably. I was down there and I got to watch him firsthand. He had laid the wood out on some of those defenders on there coming on roadblocks and from the backfield. And so kind of fun to watch, actually. And I know everybody they kind of look at some of these clips that have been posted out there. I say, oh, this isn't going to work. I mean, he's an offensive lineman making this transition in year 3. I get all that. At the same time, Shayne, there's something that kind of intrigues me about this. Like, maybe arguably the best fullback in over the last 2 years in the NFL is Patrick Ricard of the Ravens.
Mhm.
The guy's 6'3", 305 pounds. And so, and he's actually tested out as a little bit of worse athlete coming out of college than what Kendrick Green did. And so Green, we knew the guy was nimble-footed and athletic. That was never in question. What was in question, we saw after his first year, is the guy really, really struggles to anchor. That's not his forte.
Yeah.
That's not his strong suit. Where he's good is getting out in space, getting to the second level, and just cracking somebody head on. And we've seen that early in camp, the signs of, okay, maybe there's something for him here. Maybe he can be kind of a dual role, multiple hats kind of guy. He can be the primary backup center. Maybe he can be a guy that comes on the field as a fullback or an H-back in situational football.
Yeah, I think that's really the question here. Is like it's a lot of fun. Like everyone who's been there, including you, like everyone loves it, right? It's great. It's a cool story. It's fun to watch out there because he just looks out of place. And the Patrick Ricard comment I think is really important here because we've seen this kind of work at least, right? Like at least with Patrick Ricard. Now he is an outlier, of course, and dealing with outliers is always a question mark. But Green does have a skill set that really mirrors what fullbacks are asked to do in the modern NFL and really forever as a lead blocker, as a guy who gets out to the second level in space. Like it removes a lot of the question marks in his game as a blocker, right? However, I think the problem with it is, can he be good enough at that to have a full-time roster spot, or does he have to show he can actually legitimately play center if he needs to in order to keep a roster spot that way? I think that's really what it comes down to. And if you're the Steelers, if he plays well enough at center as well, and also can show he can play some fullback when you want to go heavier instead of having Connor as the main fullback, then yeah, maybe he does deserve a spot in the 53, maybe even the active roster at times, right? Like the active 40, whatever it is, 46, 47. But it's going to come down to whether he can play backup center. I think it's really what it comes. Like, I don't think this is going to move the needle enough to give him a roster spot. So it's fun for now. But if they decide they want to have a true backup center and not just kind of go with like if Cole goes down, Daniel's the center and mix around the guards, like then yeah, he very well could earn himself a spot, and this would help him a little bit.
Yeah, and if it comes down to like a competition, Shayne, you're talking like him, Ryan McCollum, maybe an outside guy. If he does offer that little bit of something extra where it's like, all right, we can get you on the field for a couple plays a game here and there. I mean, that's something worth considering. Now, obviously, we have to wait and see if this is something that's even going to benefit the team at all. We'll see if it's used in preseason.
I'd like to see that if we're going to.
And I think they will deploy him there, Shayne, because I think the coaching staff is legitimately interested. Like, what do you provide here? And for those who say, oh, you can't take an offensive lineman and make him a fullback. Well, teams have done it before. You already pointed out that the Patrick Ricard situation is pretty exceptionally rare. Like this is it's not normal to have a fullback like this, but in today's game, Shayne, it's not really normal to have a fullback. I mean, there's only like 12 or 14
very
teams
different,
carry a fullback on the roster. What I will say though is anybody that thinks that Green is not athletic enough, if you're pointing to athleticism as the reason why he can't do this, I wouldn't say that because he's actually more athletic than some of the fullbacks who are still on NFL rosters today. In fact, Kendrick Green ran a faster 40 than Zach Gentry did coming out of college for what it's worth. And so the guy ran a 4.89 and he's pretty quick footed. We don't know if he has a role on an NFL roster at all, but I'm at least interested to see. You spent the third round pick on the guy. If he can't cut it at anything, then you know that what you have is just, it's time to end the experiment.
Yeah.
But if he does offer something, if he can be a serviceable backup at center, and if he can be a quality fullback or H-back in certain situations for the Steelers, then that's something that offers a little bit of intrigue. Now, the thing is, the Steelers already have excellent depth at tight end. And so if you're going to use him in that H-back nub role right there on the side of the line of scrimmage, you've got guys that can do that already.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you're taking Connor Hayward off the field, who is certainly going to be the better receiver of
Yeah.
that fullback H-back role. It's one of those things that you have to consider, but also know that, I mean, Steelers got guys that can already wear multiple hats, like a Hayward there. But I am a little bit intrigued by it. I'm not brushing it away completely, like a lot of fans are doing.
I think
Say, "Oh,
it's
this is
fair
ridiculous."
to give him a shot and see, because the way I see
Mhm.
it is we've had trouble in the short yardage and red zone game for the last couple of years, right? Despite our back being 240 pounds or so, the push just hasn't always been there, right? To kind of help get those
Yeah.
short yard situations and red zone situations, you get those touchdowns. He might be valuable just from that perspective as a blocker in those situations. And it
Mhm.
would be a tip if he's on the field that it's probably going to be a run. But like in those situations, teams are
Yeah.
already expecting the run anyway. Like it's not like and especially if
Mhm.
it's a true heavy set, like yeah, you could play action off of it, and like in that case, it doesn't matter because he's not going to be one of the targets anyway. It's going to be with tight end or maybe the one wide receiver on the wide side of the field, like whatever it may be. So I think he could be valuable just in those situations alone. Which again, unless he's, and this is all comes back down to like he has to win the backup center job, and it has to be a rosterable spot. Like the Steelers have to decide they need a true backup center. If that happens, then I could see this mattering a lot more. But
Yeah, sadly, Shane, the Steelers don't seem to be in the business of disguising their intent a lot of
no, not
times,
really. Not with
because
Matt
like
Canada,
last year,
especially. So
we can see when Miles Boykin,
yeah,
Gunnar
when he was on the
Olszewski,
field, it
yeah,
was a
when
run.
these
Yeah,
guys are on the field, there's a good chance Steelers are running the football. They're doing a
yeah,
jet sweep, or they're at least faking the jet sweep. And so you're
yeah,
probably right there. If Green's going to be out there, it probably means that we know what the Steelers are doing. I just don't know if they care. They want to line up and dominate the other side of the football. But please do throw in play action every once in a while. I
that
think
would
you
be
can keep
nice.
the
Yeah,
defense on its heels a little bit. For what it's worth, kind of an interesting thing though, and so keep an eye on that
yeah,
this Friday night, and we'll see if the Steelers throw Kendrick Green out
that'd be
there at
fun.
fullback at
Yeah.
all. Be interesting to see the results of those plays if
Hmm.
they indeed do. All right, we're going to move on to our first big discussion topic for today. Before I do that, please chime in with the
Yes.
chat. We are live here. And if you have any questions you want to ask us, please chime in and we would love to get to those questions. All right, Shane, biggest observations from Steelers training camp. I was there over the weekend. I know that you had plans to come
Yeah,
and meet
didn't
me
work
there.
out,
They kind of fell through
unfortunately.
a little bit.
Yeah,
That's all right. I'll be your eyes for now.
good.
And
Okay,
hopefully we can get down there together sometime soon.
absolutely.
Let's take a look, and I'm going to go through some of my biggest notes. Lots of things to note from down there, and I went back through after the practices and kind of studied the things that I had found most intriguing. And so I collected all this data after the weekend, kind of put it together. And so I'm going to go through some of the biggest here. I want to talk about Darnell Washington. This is a player that's getting a lot of buzz, and rightfully so. Like, you see the guy live in person, he is a spectacle. I mean,
Yeah, I imagine.
he looks the part. I mean, he legitimately looks like a cross between a tight end and an offensive tackle. And Daniel Jeremiah was down there when I was there, actually, Shane.
Hmm.
And Jeremiah said that he's convinced that Darnell is playing at about 290 right now. And I don't know if that's the case or not. I mean, he was already 270 at his pro day.
Right.
The guy looks big. And where he dominates is when those pads come on and the Steelers have those practices. So that's the good part about his game. Run blocking, all that kind of stuff, even in pass protection. Like he handled TJ Watt. Like I was there watching the one-on-ones, and he did that backs on backers drill as well as you can do that for a player in that position has to go against a former defensive player of the year like Watt. Now, at the same time, I want to be really honest about what I saw with him. Washington's a bit lumbering.
Yeah.
And I just don't know if it's something about his game that is going to change. Like, he's not a very sudden football player. And this isn't new, really, Shane. This is something that we witnessed during his time at Georgia there. Now, long strider, good down the seam, can still box people out with his body. But when it came to 7-on-7s, 11-on-11s, when I was kind of singling him out, watching him there just isn't a lot of separation in his game. Like, he's not very fluid in and out of his breaks. Like, between him and Freiermuth in terms of like route running ability, night and day different.
Yeah,
And he's just not going to be that F tight end. He is the true Y tight end, your inline blocker. And I think he could be one of the best in the league at that role. I think he's got the upside for that at least. But he is going to be limited a bit as a receiver. So if you're expecting this guy to be Gronkowski, right, which isn't fair to begin with, or any of the like, name your 6'6", 6'7" tight end, he's not going to be the most fluid player. And as a result, I don't think he's going to get targeted a ton because he's always going to have kind of that linebacker, that safety right in his hip pocket. I mean, you're going to have to throw it high and away. And fortunately, he has a massive catch radius. It's going to be one of the biggest in the league with his wingspan. But I think he is going to be a little bit limited as a receiver. I just noticed of the group, he is much, much closer to Zach Gentry as a receiver than he is to Freiermuth. And that might just kind of be the case with him. Still pleased with the pick. I'm really pleased with what I saw, particularly as a blocker down there. But I think that he could kind of be limited in that aspect of his game.
Yeah, and again, this is nothing that's really unexpected. I think that was kind of the book on him coming out, was that if he was drafted higher than he was, which again, he fell a little bit because of possible future knee concerns and stuff like that. But we kind of knew that if he was ever going to be a higher pick, it was really based on his upside as a blocker and somebody who could be a red zone target, right? This was not going to be a full-time, like he's getting 8-9 targets a game. It's not going to be his role. But I think that what he does well, like you said, Tom, I think it's very, very valuable for a team, especially like the Steelers, who clearly want to get the running game going to the point where it can be the focal point of the offense, right? Him as a run blocker on the move, especially, I think is going to be devastating against certain teams that just can't handle that size. And then on top of that, you talk about as a pass blocker. I think he's a better pass blocker right now than he is a run blocker, honestly. Like that's kind of where I see him making a huge impact on certain plays where they keep him in actually as a pass blocker, where he doesn't even go out for a route to begin with, and just kind of help out, whether it's Dan Moore or Core for whoever needs help against certain assignments. That can be a really important role for him early on. And then you talked about lumbering and like everything else. I do think he has good build-up speed. Like you said, I think he can get down the seam if given enough time, and he can run away from guys if he has enough time to get up to speed. But it just takes him a while, right? So it has to be long developing plays, or it has to be like you throw him like a little crosser where he's already run up and gotten up to speed, and he can kind of scoot down the sideline. We saw that at Georgia a couple of times. There's ways to get him involved as a receiver. It's just not clearly as simple as it is getting Pat Freiermuth the ball, right? It's not just like, oh, he's going to be open, so throw him the ball. So that's what's going to be different about those two,
Yeah, and don't look for a guy that's going to be like snapping in and out of his breaks and create a ton of separation. Like that's just not his game.
It's not fair for a guy that size to do that.
No, but I'm going to stick with my original prediction, Shane. I loved this guy. I mean, I would have been content with one of the second round picks. That's how much I liked him as a blocker and just the sheer physical specimen that you were getting there. And I still think that fans are going to be very pleased with this pick overall. It's just going to be mostly as a blocker, someone as a receiver, and he will wow you at times as a receiver where he can just go up and snag the ball with one hand or whatever, catch it in traffic. He has that ability to do that. It's just never going to be probably at a consistent basis with that part. But I agree with the pass blocking stuff. I mean, outstanding. Like it's as good as I remember seeing at training camp from a rookie tight end, and worlds beyond Freiermuth. I think that he's a better blocker today than what Freiermuth is, where Freiermuth is more of the receiving tight end. And I think that he's a guy that can like negate a Myles Garrett. If you put him out there to chip with Dan Moore, I mean, he's going to get a nice little chip there at the beginning, more so than anybody else can offer. And that's why he was called the 6th offensive lineman at Georgia.
That's why.
It's not hard to see why. And so very talented football player, you can see. And so that's the good and the bad with him. Let's move on to my next observation here. And this is anytime Kenny Pickett was thrown to Calvin Austin, there's a big adjustment that needs to be made here. And it's not that this connection has been bad. They've connected on several like 40+ yard plays at camp so far. It's just so different. Like when you have a George Pickens and you loft that ball up back shoulder, you got to throw to Austin in a very different way than you do to Pickens, because a guy that's 5'7", 3/4, 170 pounds soaking wet, when he tries to put his foot in the ground and come back for the football, you're not going to get the same results. And so instead of lofting that ball up there for him, everything seems like it's been a bit underthrown, Shane. And I don't know if that's because trying to make that adjustment, you're throwing to Pickens on the outside and you're throwing to Allen Robinson and Hakeem Butler on the outside. And all of a sudden, Austin does a wheel route. You throw to him on the outside. He can't put his foot in the ground and go up and get the ball. Even with as explosive as he was and the phenomenal athlete he is, you're always going to have limitations with 30-inch arms and being a sub 5'8" football player. Where Pickens needs to be better and this connection needs to grow with his chemistry is try to overthrow the guy. I mean, that's honestly how you have to look at it. Try to overthrow the guy with 4.32 speed and trust that Austin is going to be able to run underneath that football as he pulls away from cornerbacks down the field, because there are very few cornerbacks, if we're being honest, that are going to be able to stick with him stride for stride if that ball is put out there. And so I noticed that it's nearly every pass that I witnessed, Shane, and there were several deep shots from Pickett to Austin. everything was just a little bit underthrown. It's just enough where, yes, if it was a bigger receiver, they could do the back shoulder at that point because the defender's face guarding you. You can put your foot in the ground. You can go high point the football. Don't make Austin do that. Do what's going to be best for him. Hit him in stride in the middle of the field on these crossers. Like, lead him out there. Let him track that ball down, especially down the field, because you're not going to win often with that height if it's in a contested situation. So it's Pickett's job, I think, to kind of make that adjustment from throwing to a 6'3 1/4 Pickens who can jump through the roof to a 5'7 3/4 Calvin Austin who has speed to burn. Throw that ball out there and let him trek it down.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it does come back to he just hasn't had the opportunity to throw those type of true like moon ball type deep balls, right? Because last year the closest we had to someone who could get down the field in the way that Calvin did is Deontay, and he still doesn't have the straight line speed that Calvin has, right? You look at a guy like Pickens, you're trying to throw the ball in a position where he can just go up and body the corner because it's more likely to be completed that way. And with Calvin, like you talked about, he does have a role, I think, as a true deep threat from the outside. I think he can do that as the Z, but you do have to prepare yourself to throw those balls a little bit differently. And I think a key thing for a lot of quarterbacks, right, and I've noticed this for a long time, is releasing the ball sooner is a huge part of this. Okay, I'm not just waiting for him to separate. I'm throwing the ball to somewhere where he can outrun the corner, right? And that's a big part of throwing a deep ball that I think a lot of people don't realize is like most deep balls that are completed in the NFL, like sometimes they do just dust the corner and they're open for the whole time, but you're trying to throw the ball to a spot where by the time the ball gets there, your receiver is going to beat that corner, right? Like, they have, a step on them and now they're going to have 3 or 4 by the time the ball gets there. Kenny has to get used to that. He just doesn't know how to really, I don't think he really has to do that a whole lot or had to do that a whole lot last year. It just didn't pop up. If it does pop up this year, if you get the opportunity to throw that, he does, though, like you said, he has to be ready to be able to put that ball out there farther and just trust Calvin to run under it.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Shane. If you wait half a second too long with a guy that runs legit 4.3, you're not going to be able to hit him in stride because a player like Pickett is just not going to to the arm strength. I'm not knocking him.
He's not throwing 70 yards down. No, it's just not going to happen.
Yes,
and most guys don't. Most guys don't.
So unless you're like Josh Allen and these rare exceptions, like
that's about
these physical freaks. Like it's like Drew Brees threw in stride, and that's how he was so good. At
one of the best deep ball throwers ever. Yeah, and it's not because he was throwing the ball 50 yards.
No, he didn't wait, and then try to throw like a 65-yard pass and stride down the field. It just doesn't work that way. So you're right. Hitting him in stride is going to help. And Shayne, it's also important to remember Calvin Austin was on he never played a preseason snap
he
last
didn't
year.
Play with Pickett at all. So,
he was injured so early in training camp that these two have to rebuild this chemistry again. And so it's unfortunate we're 1 year behind the curve now. I would have liked to have already started that connection and be a year ahead of the track. But now it's going to be that adjustment because I will say that Pickett to Pickens connection is legit. I mean, those two are on the same page. Pickett is really good with those back shoulder fades, and he trusts his big receiver to go up and get the ball. It's just going to be an adjustment when it comes to Calvin Austin. You can't throw to him the same way. Those two receivers could not be more opposite. And so I think it's one that it will come in time, but it's something that definitely I noticed has to improve in the coming weeks. All right, Shayne, I want to talk about a player who, this might be a little bit surprising, I think was the player that stood out to me the very most when I was down at practice over the weekend, and that's Connor Hayward. And I got to admit, like, I was not the biggest Connor Hayward. I was not the biggest fan of drafting a fullback. I mean, it's just the way I think that most teams can get away without having one. But Hayward is so much more versatile than the player that I was envisioning coming out of Michigan State. And he has been phenomenal at camp so far. I mean, even just his route running, for example, and what I watched down there from him, it just constantly stood out to me. Like, he's snapping his head around in and out of his breaks. Like, he's creating separation. He's snagging balls like effortlessly, like down by his ankles. And he's doing this stuff routinely. And it's like, this guy can line up anywhere. He looks like, I said in one of my articles, Shayne, I think he looks like an 8-year veteran out there, just knows everything to do. I mean, when it comes to even running the positional drills, he was second behind Freiermuth every time running these drills, like over Zach Gentry. And the guy just knows what to do. He knows where to be. And I don't care if he's sub 6 foot. I don't care if he's not a great athlete. The guy is just a born football player, and it runs in his blood. It's not hard to see why with his dad and his brother. And so he can wear so many hats for this team. I'm actually pretty excited about what he'll offer them in 2023.
Yeah, and you go back to him at Michigan State, and like he started as a running back, didn't have the
Mhm.
athleticism really cut it there. And then Kenneth Walker comes in, and they kind of put him more in that fullback H back role, and he did everything for that team,
Yeah.
special teams, fullback, tight end, and you see it coming in the NFL. And I think the question with him was, can he
Yeah.
replicate that at the NFL level? Because it's a whole different ball game
Mhm.
to be, like you said,
That was
sub
and that was
six
the
foot
question that
and
I had. Yes.
yeah, like sub 6 foot, and you're like, 230, 40 pounds. It's
Mhm.
just a lot to ask somebody to play at that height and that body type and be a hybrid player. But he has shown more, even last year. I mean, some of the catches he made, some of the plays that he made last year as a rookie, like we should be expecting even more of that type of stuff from him, even though they did add Darnell Washington and everything else. It doesn't really eat into his role though. So it's going to be a different conversation with him. But yeah, I think you're right. Like he's going to wear a lot of hats for this team, and I think he's going to make an even bigger
Mhm.
impact, not just on the field, but in the stat sheet too. I do think he's going to get more total touches. He's going to get the ball in his hands a little bit more, and he's really blocked the hell out of some people this camp. I've seen
Mhm.
a lot of clips of that too. Like he's going to have a huge
Mhm.
role in this team compared to what fullbacks generally have in the NFL nowadays.
Yeah, and he's been holding up well in like the backs on backers. I mean,
Yep.
everything that they've asked him to do, he looks good at it. Even when
Yeah.
they ran like that Oklahoma drill, the guy is just so far advanced of what he should be for a guy coming into his second
Yeah. You
training camp,
think?
and
Yeah, that you'd
it's
expect.
it's
Yeah.
crazy to see that. But like you said, Shane, like he did all these things at Michigan State, but I'm like, all right,
Will
he's
it
very
translate? Yeah.
undersized for the position. He's kind of, I mean, tested as a very average athlete.
Yeah.
He's just way further along than I thought he would be. I see a lot of 22 personnel in the
Hmm.
future, I would have to guess, because they're going to want to get this guy in the field. And so I'm excited for what he offers this year. All right, let's talk about Broderick Jones here. The big one. I mean, this is Steelers' first round selection. I'm a big Broderick Jones fan. He was my selection if the Steelers made that pick in the first round. He's the guy that I wanted. I think there's a ton of upside to be had here. This former 5-star recruit, freaky athlete at left tackle. It's left tackle is obviously one of the most important positions in football. Unfortunately, Shane, what I saw over the weekend showed me that Jones isn't quite there yet. There were certainly flashes, not quite there yet. In 11 on 11s, much better as a run blocker from what I witnessed down at camp over the weekend than he was in pass protection. He did get dusted a few times in pass pro with a little ghost move from Quincy Roche and a few others. I'd have to go back and look at my notes there. But the pass protection was not as pretty as it was in the run blocking game, where I thought he kind of stood out there in a positive light. The overall sample, though, kind of showed me like Dan Moore was a little bit more consistent down there. And I was hoping a couple weeks in this training camp, maybe that paradigm shift would happen already. It might take a little bit longer than I expected here. And I kind of said from the beginning, Shane, I wouldn't be surprised if this is like the Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky scenario all over again, where it's like, all right, we get into week 3, week 4, and now we're starting to think about maybe a transition here. And a lot of that will depend on how Dan Moore is doing at the time. Like
Yeah.
if he's doing really well, there may be no reason to rush Jones on the field. At the same time, what the biggest knock on Broderick in college is that he just doesn't have reps. I mean, the guy started one full season at Georgia, a very partial season prior to that, and then never played. The guy was sitting behind Andrew Thomas at left tackle, Jamari Salyer the year after. And so he's sitting behind NFL
Yes,
players.
NFL like more than NFL college
Yes. Oh,
players,
and
yeah.
Andrew Thomas is probably maybe a top 3 left tackle in the game already.
Right
And so
now,
it's
yeah,
great
for
to
sure.
sit and learn from him. And a lot of people have compared him to a similar type prospect. I want to see him get out there sooner rather than later. Obviously, we know that the job's going to be his at some point. He's the more talented player of the two. Not that Moore just grossly lacks talent or anything that way, but there's a reason why Moore was the mid 4th round pick, and Broderick you trading up for to the 14th overall selection. And so we want that transition to happen because Broderick is ready. We don't want the transition to happen just because Dan Moore is struggling or something that way. So from my observation, I think it's going to take a little bit longer than I was initially hoping for.
Yeah, let me ask you with his pass protection, because I feel like I have an idea, because I haven't been able to see many clips of it. Was he
Yeah.
lunging a lot?
Yes. And that's what he did at Georgia.
That's
doing the head lunge. That's how I would say like 70% of the time that it wasn't a pretty rep. It was because he was lunging forward, putting his head down, kind of the stuff we saw on his draft tape a lot.
That's what I figured,
and so he's got to clean up the technique. Like we know the guy is strong in respect to his frame. We know that he's a great athlete. He's a 96th percentile athlete in respect to the left tackle or the offensive tackle position. He just has to clean up those mechanics, and he's got to be a lot more consistent, because if you have a couple of those reps in a game where you lunge forward and just completely whiff on the guy, I mean, you can
That can
get
get your
smashed.
quarterback killed. Yeah.
And I think that's going to be the determining factor of what the Steelers decide to do here and why they could enter the season with Dan Moore, because they'll say, we just can't have these ugly reps happening like that.
Yeah, and I think that's the one problem with this team drafting a tackle like Broderick Jones is we love the upside. You know he's going to play eventually, but they are very much concerned about being competitive right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a team like the Giants, when they drafted a guy like Andrew Thomas, who did have a rough rookie season because he did have some things to clean up and he'd have to work on stuff. He had the luxury of going out there every day and being able to lose those battles and learn from them. Whereas Broderick might not get that chance as soon as Thomas did, because Steelers are trying to make sure that Kenny Pickett stays upright. And that's obviously the right decision. So I'm not criticizing that if they don't play him immediately. But you do want to see Broderick hopefully get to a point where he at least is good enough in pass protection consistently, where you're not worried about the true like whiffs where Kenny gets depleted from behind and, force fumbles. Like, as long as that isn't going to be a major issue, I think that once that gets to that point, we will see him out there. Maybe even sooner than that if they just feel like it's just time to do it. But it does seem like the tackles in general just haven't been very good at camp. But again, you're dealing with Alex Highsmith and TJ Watt, and Herbig's looked great, and which obviously happy about that. So like, I give them a little bit of leeway because you're not going to face that level of pass rush every time that they play, but it's still something you would have liked to see a little bit be a little bit better this year. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned it, Shayne, like if the Steelers were a bit more forward thinking or future minded, then maybe they would make this transition from day one, say, hey, we're going to take our lumps early in the season. Right. He's going to be more refined by the end of the year. But they do care so much about each and every game. And that's a good thing, because you
especially with how the team is built right now. Yeah.
So for that reason, like if I just had to make a prediction right now based on what I saw and I witnessed there at camp, I think that Dan Moore will begin the season as the starter, and a lot can change over the next 3 weeks of preseason games. And we can see just the shift happening as we watch, and it can happen really quickly.
It probably won't take that much for it to change. And that's the key thing, is not a whole lot has to change for that to happen.
Yeah, and I will say that it's not one of those things where it's like, oh my goodness, just Dan Moore is just so much further ahead than Broderick right now, because there have been practices when I wasn't down there observing that it certainly looked like Broderick Jones was the better player of the two, and so it's kind of a back and forth thing. I think Moore has been more consistent overall, and that's going to give him the edge, at least starting in these preseason games and being listed as a starter for now. So I'm interested to see how that ends up. And like I said, at the end of the day, Shayne, you're only going to keep the 14th overall pick on the bench for so long. I mean, the guy's going to come in
He's going to be
at some point early in the season. Yep. All right, let's talk about my next note here. That's Keanu Benton. Really stood out to me while I was down there. This is your guy, Shayne, my Wisconsin guy right here.
Yep.
Benton is, I will say, if Broderick is a little bit behind where I thought he would be, Benton's a little bit further ahead. And so that's a good thing, because you're going to be calling on him often this year. I think, even though I don't care what the Steelers initial depth chart says,
it's not going to,
it doesn't matter. I mean, you that's basically just a nod to like seniority on the team. It's
pretty much
not going to be
part,
Montrevious Adams. I would be surprised if he's
starting nose tackle.
By the start of the season. Benton, I think, is going to be that guy for the Steelers. He's going to play nose. He's going to be a guy that can play situational football, come in nickel and pair him with a Cam Hayward or an Ogunjobi, because I just think that he's going to be probably the third best interior defender on this team, probably from the gate. And so what I saw from him down there, Shayne, was just a combination of things, like in the one-on-one drills, the O-line versus D-line, had some really nice moves. Like I always liked his bend and in his hand fight there at Wisconsin. And so definitely one with a couple easy reps there. Now he was going against second team. I think a couple of the reps were like against Ryan McCollum maybe. And so it's not like you're going against the most grand competition, but it's nice to see those wins. And then when we did get in 11-on-11 situations, Shayne, in the first and second team, against the first and second team offense, he had some really nice run fits as well, and including one where he just instantly knifed into the backfield and dropped Anthony McFarland for like a 2-yard loss. And so you love to see those type of plays show up, get the crowd hooping and hollering, because he definitely stood out to me while I was down there. And I think this is a guy that they're going to call on, and I wouldn't be surprised by next year, Shayne, if he trails only Cameron Hayward as the best interior defender on the team.
Right. And I think for me, and like, I'm glad to hear that. I did see reports of that as well. Whenever you were at that practice, I saw a lot of that too. And I think for me, what I'm hoping to see from him is I just want him to be able to hold up well enough in the run game as rookie to fill that nose
Yeah.
tackle role. And I think it's going to be more of like when we had Javon Hargrave, right? Where like he wasn't a
Mhm.
true like nose, but he played that position for us, and he kind of was a
True.
playmaker as run defender opposed to a gap eater. I think it's going to be more of that, like the play where he
Yeah.
knifed in and got McFarland. Like that's the type of play that you'll see him splash the run game. He's probably not going to be a super consistent run defender, just because, again, if you ask him to play nose, not quite that type of player, but it can work for what we need him to be.
Mhm.
And then it comes down like I think he's already a relatively advanced pass rusher. Like I think he has legitimate pass rush moves. He has the bend, like you talked about. This is a guy that if you put him in on third down against especially centers, like I just don't think a lot of centers are going to handle him very well. And that's going to be a huge advantage to the pass rush on certain situations where you want to get all your best guys out there for, the got to have it down. So he will, I think, early in the season even be one of those guys that's out there
Mhm.
for those.
Yeah, and there's not a one size fits all when it comes
Mhm.
to the nose tackle position or the zero technique
Right.
in that base 3-4 defense. And Hargrave is the perfect example of that. I mean,
Right.
this Hargrave is certainly a player who fits the 4-3 mold as that 3 technique rusher
Yeah.
a lot better than he does as
Penetrating
a
defensive tackle. Yeah.
yes, as a penetrating defensive tackle, much better than he does as a I'm going to 2-gap you and hold up at the
Yeah,
line of scrimmage.
exactly.
But there's still a lot of value in a guy that can kind of knife in there and get
Mhm.
pressure that way and be disruptive in his own way. And I do think that, I mean, at least in terms of his tape at Wisconsin, I did think that Benton was further along as a pass rusher than he was as a run defender. Like he
Right.
needs to get
Yeah.
more stout and more
Agreed.
consistent in that area of his game still. But there's a lot of value in that guy. And a lot of times, Shayne, honestly, you want to get the best football players on the field. And so
Exactly. Yeah.
if you're taking and just give you an example out here, like if you put Braden Fajoku on the field to be just that zero tech plugging nose tackle, and he offers nothing in terms of pass rush, if I can get a guy who might not be quite as stout in the run like a Benton, but can get in the backfield and offer pressure more consistently. I mean, obviously situation, down and distance, all that stuff has to be
That's all going
considered.
to factor in. Yeah.
But typically, you want to get your most talented players on the field, and I don't have any question that Benton is more talented than most of that group that they have there, more so than the Armon Watts, and more so than the Fajokus and the Montravius Adamses. And so, and all these guys again offer a little bit different a role. I think Benton though will be that versatile guy that can kind of do a little bit of everything because he's got that build. He's got that frame that can hold up against double team blocks if you need him to. But he also is nimble enough and agile enough that he can kind of cut in the backfield and make some things happen in the passing game too. So I'm excited to see what he brings. Keep your eye on him. That'll be a fun player to watch
And
this
I
preseason.
think it'd be different too if we had a true like dominant run defensive, like run stop and defensive tackle on
Yeah,
the
it would
roster.
be. Yes.
Like if we had a Grover Stewart
Yep.
or a DJ Reader or whoever, like
Exactly.
it'd be different. But because we don't really have that, if it's 3rd and 1 and I need to stop, I'm probably going to put the guy in who might be able to beat the center
Yeah.
outright and tackle the running back in the backfield, opposed to just the guy plugging up gaps. Like that's kind of where I think this team is at with the run defense, and I think that's fine for the most part.
Yeah, and honestly, like Shayne, if that were the case and the Steelers had their DJ Reader, they had their dominant run defender, then maybe Benton, we wouldn't be talking about him as a nose tackle at all. Like
Right,
he's
he would just be
versatile
a
enough
third.
where,
He'd just be a 3 tech.
yes,
Yeah, which
he
he
could
will
be
be
the,
eventually anyway.
yes, and so it'll be interesting to see where they move him. I do think he has position flex all along that defensive
Pretty
line,
much,
which is
yeah.
good.
Mhm.
So, and again, it's another example. I don't think that Larry Ogunjobi is like the perfect 5 technique, like in terms of frame and how he wins.
But he
Yet
works.
the Steelers are putting him on the field in that position. And so it'll be interesting because there's a lot of moving pieces here. I'm interested to see what they do with DeMarvin Leal. And so I think this preseason will kind of give us a sense of how these players are going to be planned to be used in the 2023 season. All right, enough about Benton. Let's move on. Got a few more talking points here, my observations. I know you can talk about Benton all day long.
Yeah, I don't want to do that though. Okay, go ahead.
All right, let's talk about George Pickens here. He is a cut
Also
above
like
the
to talk
wide
about
receiver
him,
group
yeah.
in terms of talent. Like it just jumps off the page at you really when you're down there and watch him. And this is nothing against Deontay. It's nothing against other players who happen to win in easier ways than he does. Like Deontay's a great separator.
Yep.
But if you were to know nothing about this wide receiver group at all prior to seeing them, and you were to go down there for a couple of days and watch them at training camp, leave no doubt, George Pickens is the most talented player of the group with what he can do. And it's not just winning the occasional wow play down the sideline. And everybody obviously saw the big viral play jumping over Joey Porter Jr., bringing that ball up over the top. But he does it more consistently than you think. And it's not just on the go routes too. Like he can really stretch for those to rise up for those passes on slants and posts. And so deep comebacks he was being used, and just the toe tapping ability and the range that this guy possesses is just, it's crazy. And so that was a big takeaway that I had from being down there, Shayne, was just how much more talented he is really than the next guy in this wide receiver room. And it's nice to have guys that win in different ways, because they do need a separator still, like a Deontay. They could really use the speed of a Calvin Austin, but you watch him of the players of that group, but also with the players who win in similar ways. Like there's just no contest between him and Al Robinson, him and Hakeem Butler. Like he's just to the exponent there. So just a specimen to watch down there for sure.
Yeah, I think the thing about George is that it's not just that he's talented, right? It's that he's very uniquely talented. He is a very different type of player than not just the rest of the Steelers receivers, but really across the league. There just isn't many guys who are so good at what he specifically does that they are a effective player, right? Like you've seen guys flash in that way, like a Kenny Golladay, for example, or guys like that who flash that ability, but then it just never really translates long term. Pickens is a different type of talent in that regard, where he can, for the most part, I legitimately believe that he could be a 1,000-yard receiver in a good passing offense pretty consistently, even if he doesn't really develop much beyond where he's at right now as a route runner and things like that. Now, obviously, we want to see that. It's going to really elevate his game, allow him to be like a true number one receiver. But even where he is right now, it's just really hard to deal with him for pretty much any corner in the league. There's very few guys who physically can hang with him well enough to really affect his ability to catch the football. I mean, Joey Porter's literally the prototype corner to deal with George Pickens, right? He's long, tall, fast enough, all that stuff, sticky in coverage, and it just didn't matter sometimes. It still doesn't matter sometimes. That tells you a lot about the kind of player he is. And I do think that if they can tap into that even more this year, and then hopefully get him in the open field a little bit more and let him use some of his athleticism that he's shown, we could be looking at a serious year two breakout situation for George.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's a stretch, Shayne, to say that this guy has generational talent in terms of his ability to
specifically that ability. Yes. Yeah.
That niche can be so special, because it honestly reminds me that specific ability, and not necessarily the overall game.
Right.
Like he's not the route runner of a DeAndre Hopkins.
Right. We've talked about Hopkins before. Like that specific ability in the air.
Yeah. Yes. And like, he's not like as physically violent after the catches like what Des Bryant was.
Right.
But in terms of just the ability to go up and get the football and just natural ball tracking ability, I think he's going to be on par with those guys. I really do. Like he's that special at that niche. And so I think that that's something the Steelers need to take advantage of a lot. Like, and Kenny Pickett just said, I mean, he's like, if it's one-on-one situation,
he's getting
I'm going to find, I'm going to get the ball.
It makes too much sense.
It's the right thing to do, because again, you had 109.3 passer rating when Steelers quarterbacks threw to him last year. And that was not a particularly great passing season by Trubisky and Pickett combined.
Right.
And so get the guy the football, you play to his strengths. Boy, that back shoulder connection, it was looking strong while I was down there, Shayne, and it happened again. And even, I mean, there was when I was there, that they capped off the practice with a 2-minute drill and a touchdown, that toe tapping touchdown to Pickens over the middle of the field there. And so I'm really excited for that connection down there. And I think that Pickens has a chance to be special in that regard. All right. We will wrap up my observations with talking about Kenny Pickett right now. And the strides that he made from last year to where he is right now, Shayne, very, very easy to see. And you could tell this just by like reading other people's practice notes and what they were saying about him. But you get down there in person for a couple practices and you watch him, the guy just overflows with confidence. And it's a night and day difference from last year. And it's not that Pickett wasn't a confident player to begin with, because I think that his personality and his confidence was one of his strengths. But you can see that this guy is not afraid to sling it this year. I mean, he's throwing the ball deeper down the field. He's doing it with more frequency than he did last year. He's keeping his eyes down. That maybe the biggest one of all, Shayne, that I noticed from Pickett, when that he feels that pressure coming, he's keeping his eyes down the field, and that head isn't moving as he's scrambling around, and he's finding players and throwing on the run, delivering accurate passes on the run, Whereas before, I noticed, and I was down there last year, and I kind of watched him in some of those situations, he would kind of just tuck that ball in his arm and take off with it. You like to see this type of growth with him where it's like, I'm going to be pass first. I'm always going to be pass first, and I'm going to keep my eyes down the field. This is how Pickett's going to win. I said it when the Steelers drafted him. He doesn't have elite arm talent, but boy, the guy can really throw on the run. And when he's scrambling, I think that's where he can be at his best. And so definitely encouraged by some of those plays that I saw from him down there, and even just operating in timing, delivering good passes on those 20-yard comeback routes towards the sideline. And just, I was impressed with what I saw this year, and noticeable difference, Shayne, in terms of his performance at training camp when I viewed him this time last year, when I was down there for a couple of days last year compared to a couple of days this year. A night and day difference that way.
Yeah, and I think that everyone has been saying the same thing, right? Everyone who saw him last year, went to camp last year. There's a huge difference the way he's operating, right? And the aggressiveness, the ability to stay either in the pocket or at least keep his eyes downfield when he escapes the pocket. Like, all those things are better than last year. And I think with Kenny, the thing that's really interesting about him, and you talked about it, like the arm talent isn't anything special. It's definitely league average-ish. Maybe this year it's a little bit better. I've seen reports of him getting a little bit stronger, which is great. But his ability to still throw the ball with accuracy and velocity while throwing on the run is probably his most elite trait that he's going to have in the NFL. Like, if he has a gotta have it trait, like something that's going to allow him to get those huge plays, that's going to be it. And I think that's totally fine. I think it's more than enough for him to be a really good quarterback. But his ability is, especially confidence-wise, you talked about overflowing with confidence. He has this innate ability where whenever he does have the confidence, it feels like it changes who he is as a player. Like, you look at what he did at Pitt his last year. Like, he was really confident in his receivers, his players he was playing with, his offense. He understood the offense. Once that all clicked, you got his senior season that got him drafted in the first round in the NFL draft. And I think for good reason. If that type of thing can continue in the NFL, where he does trust the play calling, which, again, who knows, maybe he's been able to convince himself and that can is not that bad. He trusts receivers. Clearly, he definitely trusts Pickens and hopefully the other guys too. We could be in line for a guy that can at least elevate this offense beyond what it normally would be capable of with the play calling.
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely reasonable. Like, in terms of second-year jumps, you expect to see them from quarterbacks. It's what we've seen historically from first-round quarterbacks, and so we need to see that with Pickett. And I think he's obviously, from what I've witnessed, on the right track of doing that. My biggest thing all along, Shayne, is, was it the right decision to bring back Canada for a third year? I know that you don't want to have another offensive coordinator change, but at the same time, I don't want Canada to be the reason that ends up ultimately hurting his confidence because he's not getting enough opportunities to showcase his ability. Like, I want to see him kind of loosen those reins a little bit.
Yes.
Let's see what he's got. And I my philosophy kind of, Shayne, when it comes to the quarterback position is, we really need to see who you are. Like, you don't want to get to year 5.
Yeah.
You don't want to get to year 5 and wonder, like, do we have a Daniel Jones on our hand? Like, you need to know who you have, and can this guy go toe to toe, so to speak, with some of the other top quarterbacks in the AFC? It's not that Pickett has to be better than a Mahomes or a Josh Allen, and it's not fair to expect him to do that. But at the same time, Shayne, everything needs to be in place. Like, with a combination of Pickett with a good defense and whatever else you have going for you, is that going to be enough? Yeah. And we need to see those major strides this year. We need to see those yards per attempt to go up. And I think that this stuff will come in time. It's just, what's the extent of it going to be? Is he going to be that game managing type quarterback for the Steelers, or is he going to be a guy that really makes his bread and butter by scrambling around, finding plays down the field? Like, that's the stuff that I get really intrigued by with Pickett. And I hope that he gets a lot of opportunity to do that with the Steelers this year. All right. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. And if you are joining us live here, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat. We would love to be able to get to those. Shayne, let's talk Steelers preseason football. It's been a long time since we got to do this. And so I'm stoked for Friday night. Steelers taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Florida. And there's going to be plenty of things to watch for. I mean, obviously, we know that in just several weeks' time, we're going to cut this 90-man roster down to 53 players. There's only one roster cut date anymore, so I'm interested to see
it's really
how teams do that. Is
it's
it
going to be
like
crazy.
all flood all at once, or do they start being a little bit more proactive and say, hey, we know you're not going to be part of the plan. We're going to get rid of you ahead of the third preseason game or whatever. So to each their own. It could be just mass chaos right before the cut down deadline as well. And so waiver claims could be made there too, depending on what the Steelers think of the strength of the rest of the roster. But I want to talk about this preseason game. I know everybody's excited to watch it. We got a little taste of preseason football, Shayne, with the Jets and Browns for anybody that decided to tune into that Hall of Fame game.
I am the sicko who watches the Hall of Fame game every year. So
I don't blame you. I mean, football is back, and so we wanted to see it, obviously. I also don't blame you if you didn't, because it's the Hall of Fame game, and you're getting like second, third, fourth.
I am admittedly a Dorian Thompson-Robinson fan, so that's a big reason I watched it.
He's a fun player.
Yeah, so.
Okay. It's coming in regards to this game right here, Shayne. Lots of things that we're going to be looking for over these next several weeks. Obviously, we know since the 17-game schedule happened 2 years ago, coming on the third year now, we have one less preseason game to watch. Unfortunately,
I was a fan of that move just because I don't want to see guys play too much and get hurt. But I get it. Yeah,
you never want to see injuries. At the same time, I love watching these backups play. I like.
That's the problem. That's the trade-off, right? So
it's the trade-off that you get in that NFLPA. I mean, there's always a compromise. You add another game in, we're getting one less preseason game. So we got the Bucs. Everybody's going to play. From what Mike Tomlin said, it's just a matter of how much.
Right.
So Shayne, before we jump into here, I'll ask you, how much would you like to see the starting unit for both sides of the ball play this game?
A quarter, I think, because I think what's going to happen is this is going to be where they play the first quarter mostly. The second preseason game, you'll see in maybe the first half or so. And then the third preseason game is mostly going to be for those last few roster spots, leave a lot of the backups to play that game. It's going to basically be, I think at least how it should be is how it used to be, where the first preseason game was usually very little, if any, starters. Second, ramp it up a little bit. Third was the dress rehearsal. And then, game 4 was for the backups. You're just going to move that up a week, right? That's kind of how I would like to see them handle it. I do want to see Kenny and the rest of the guys play a little bit on offense. I want to see this defense, minus maybe TJ and some other guys. Maybe they don't need to play that much, but I want to see a lot of these guys play with the first unit just to see how they're doing, and how they're meshing. And then the backups can come in and handle it from there.
Yeah, obviously avoiding injuries is the biggest thing. Nobody wants to see an injury here. At the same time, Shayne, these guys have very little continuity together. I mean, we look at all the changes they have. I mean, you want to get a guy like Allen Robinson involved, Calvin Austin. Those guys don't have much experience. If Darnell Washington is planning on playing with the first team offense a lot as the Y tight end, Isaac Seumalo's obviously new. I don't think we're too worried about him being the veteran most player on that offensive line and being a quality football player with the Eagles. But there are some changes here. And so you want to see this offense mesh, and same goes for the defense as well, who is more experienced all around. The defense is obviously older than the offense. But I'm hoping that we see that. And I'm hoping that a quarter is enough, Shayne, to see all right, I'm feeling pretty confident going into the second preseason game. You don't want to have those first 3 drives or whatever they give the first team offense stall out completely and be like, is that enough? I mean, we really see him in there long enough. So we want to be given just kind of a sigh of relief, I guess, after this game to say, okay, we're on the right track here. And again, it's preseason, can't take too much away from it, but you want to see positive signs at least. All right, Shayne, what to watch for? Let's start here with the offensive line performance. I think this is going to be one of the key things to look for here in this game. And for so many reasons. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here. We don't know, like we said, what time exactly Broderick is going to see that. We know that Dan Moore is going to be the starter for this game. He's listed as a starter on Steelers' first depth chart. That's going to change in time. We just don't know how soon that's going to be. And so I think one of the key things to look for on the offensive line, Shayne, is the offensive tackle performances. And really all 3 of the top guys, because first of all, how well does Dan Moore do? Does he do well enough? It's like, there's no contest. You're going to be our starter for at least the foreseeable future until we decide otherwise. Is there a big gap between Dan Moore and Broderick Jones? You're probably not going to be hoping to see that, because Broderick's likely going to be going against second stringers by the time he comes in, and Dan Moore is going to go against the first string. Is it the other way around? And then even with the quarter 4, Shayne, does a core 4 look like the third best tackle of the 3? Because I think they'll all be close enough where it's possible, even though a core 4 is going into his 6th season, it's not like he is a spectacular starter in comparison to the rest of the league. And so if it's like, oh, Broderick's looking good, Dan Moore looked really good when he was starting, Okorafor kind of looked like with the weak link. Are we now experimenting in week 2 of the preseason by saying, hey, let's throw Dan Moore over there and we'll put Broderick at tackle, left tackle. And so I'm interested to see how that whole thing shapes up. Obviously, you want to see like the interior offensive line, the strengths of the team, pretty well known, are expected to be the guards, Isaac Seumalo and James Daniels. I know the centers have kind of had a little bit of a rough go here at training camp. Mason Cole is that guy. You want to see him have a strong performance. And so the line needs to look better overall with the investments they made. The line just has to look better this year.
Yeah, I think overall, like the performance of them is going to be really important, but also I'm really curious to see what that second unit ultimately looks like when they go to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like what I would like to see a little bit too, and like especially because even though he's an established starter technically, he's a guy that might benefit from this. I would like to see Dan Moore go over to right tackle and play some in the second quarter on.
Yeah,
just to kind of, I want to see him get reps at that, right? And he's not going to do it in the starting unit because they're going to have a core 4 out there. So maybe him and Broderick can be the tackles for going into the second quarter a little bit, and then put someone else over there, Clark or whoever it is, right? But I want to see that. I'm curious, like, is Green going to be the first? Is he going to be the center that replaces Cole? Is that going to be who comes in? Are they going to get Spencer Anderson in there, center a little bit? I'm curious how that second unit and even third unit, once we get to that point, how they kind of line up and what they're doing, because that's going to mean a lot in terms of depth and like who we can expect to be the first people off the bench in certain situations or whatever else. So that's honestly kind of my biggest thing I'm looking for is how they handle that situation.
Yeah, the other thing that I want to see, Shayne, is the backup battle for guard, because it's intriguing. Like, is it going to be one of those situations where, all right, if we get an injury to Seumalo, Kevin Dotson comes in. If we get an injury to James Daniels, Herbig comes in. Or will one person separate themselves? Maybe Nate Herbig can go and say, yeah, I'm good enough to be the backup interior swing position for all 3 of the
entirely.
So I want to see their performances in comparison to each other. And it'd be nice to know, obviously, if the Steelers have some quality depth on their hands in the interior offensive line there. The depth is better all around, but we got to remember last year the Steelers were the most fortunate team in the NFL in terms of few injuries to their offensive line, never missed a starting performance of the entire 5 group, the only team to do that. We can't expect that to happen this year.
You can't bank on that every year.
If somebody goes down for a 4 or 6 game stretch or for the whole season, they need to know that they have something in place there ready to go. All right. Let's talk about the slot receiver battle, Shayne. I think this is one that's very intriguing. We mentioned it, obviously, before the start of training camp. Keep an eye on it. But I'm now that the preseason's here, I'm really interested to see how they kind of divvy up the snaps here, too, because obviously Robinson is the guy listed higher on the depth chart. He's the veteran player. They brought him in on his guaranteed salary. And so we have to assume that he's going to get a lot of looks there. But at the same time, you want to see Calvin Austin be able to carve out that role and cut into some of Allen Robinson's time because he is so dynamic and explosive with the football in his hands. And so I want to see how that battle goes. Like, is it going to be one of those ones that's like, all right, you can easily tell Robinson's the experienced guy and he's doing what he needs to do. Or is it going to be like, all right, maybe Austin's on his heels a little bit here for playing time? Because I think that's the way that fans honestly probably should be rooting. The Steelers were lacking big plays outside of George Pickens last year, and they were grossly lacking yards after the catch. And that is not something that Allen Robinson is going to provide much of at all. It's just not his game. So I think that Austin has the ability potentially to be your most efficient yak receiver in terms of yards after the catch per reception. And so I'm interested to see what he offers.
Yeah, I think for me, I do assume that Allen Robinson is going to be the guy who gets the starting nod and going to play most of the time with the starters this game. But what I'm more curious about, honestly, and what I'm kind of hoping is what ultimately happens is Calvin should be the primary slot backup and also the primary backup to Deontay Johnson. Like, that's what I'm kind of hoping for. Because realistically, like, George is the X, right? He's the guy that's going to be dealing with press coverage. You're going to allow him to do that because he can win off the line, and so can Deontay. But he's going to be a guy that you can throw the ball to in really any situation. Where I think Calvin can make an impact is you can line him up as the Z where he is off the line and he isn't going to get pressed, and he can run routes and separate from guys out there and give Kenny, although a small target, an open target. And then also from the slot position, you hope that you can get some reps out of him where he can run with the football, like you said, because Allen's not going to do that. He's going to get open. He's probably going to be able to catch the tough catches, get first downs. That's all great. But when you want explosive plays and you're trying to get an explosive play, he's not the guy you're going to go to at this point. He just isn't, right? And you hope that Calvin can at least carve out a role as the technical, backup slot receiver, but really like a situational slot receiver / C. Like that's what I think he ultimately is going to end up doing.
Yeah, and we don't know how much Canada's offense is going to change this year, but what we do
We
know
hope
is
somewhat.
yeah, and you can't finish last in yards per attempt, and part of that is not throwing the ball over the middle of the field enough. Obviously, I mean they avoided that like the plague last year.
Made
so
no sense.
Yes,
but whatever.
Get Austin on some drags, like get him a little bit of space. I want to see what he can do with the ball.
Just let him.
The guy is really
let him
fast.
Run around. Yeah,
and that was kind of his forte at Memphis. Is just he could just explode away from people, and so. They have to be better with the yards after the catch stuff this year, and I'm interested to see. Austin's a guy I want to be able to trust him with a big role on the field, ideally, so that he can help in that regard. Yeah. Let's talk about the linebackers and specifically the pecking order of the linebackers. Who comes out first, second, third? I want to see. This is going to be really interesting. Obviously, just from contractual reasons, if nothing else, we have to assume that Cole Holcomb's going to be that every down linebacker that they have, the guy that plays all three downs there. And he is the most talented of the group. I mean, the guy's a phenomenal athlete. He was coming off some pretty strong seasons before the injury, the season-ending injury in Washington last year. And then you look at the money past that, Shayne. I mean, Elandon Roberts has a 2-year, $7 million deal, where Quan only has a 1-year deal over just $1 million. And so the money would suggest that, I mean, Roberts is going to be that buck linebacker, that downhill linebacker next to Cole Holcomb in that base defense. What they do on third downs and just their general nickel, depending on down and distance, is going to be really interesting to me. Do you take Roberts off the field because of his lack of coverage ability? Do you put Quan on the field? In what situations does Mark Robinson come on the field? Because I think in many ways, Robinson and Roberts are mirrors of each other, that downhill bruising Vince Williams type linebacker, if you will. And even like a Tanner Muse, like does Muse get action on defense? Actually, this time, it's something that he wasn't really getting in Seattle, but we know the guy can move, the guy can run. He ran like a 4.42 coming out of college, and I think he has some coverage ability. So I want to see what they do there, because we know that the Achilles heel of this linebacker group, Shayne, has been their lack of ability in coverage. Not that they've been great run defenders either since Vince Williams and Shazier, but the lack of coverage ability has been concerning. They've got to get better in that regard. And so I'm really interested to see this preseason game, like who comes out with the first unit, second unit, and then situationally, like who is out there in obvious passing situations.
So all I'm going to say is I'll tell you what I kind of hope, right? Like, let's start with what we hope we do. So I do think Holcomb and Roberts are obviously the starters, right? I think Elandon Roberts is going to be that buck linebacker that we've talked about for years as a role the Steelers really care about. He's going to be the guy that blitzes. He's going to be the guy that comes downhill, hard at the line. Whereas, Holcomb's going to be more of a chase in, tackle type of player, right? And that's fine. That's a great combination. I think those two skill sets really mirror each other really well. They're pretty nice combo. I think when you need someone to come off the field and passing downs, it's obviously going to be Roberts. I do think Alexander is going to be the guy that does come in nickel situations if they don't need someone who can run downhill. Now, I think Roberts still will get third down snaps as a blitzer. I do think they're going to blitz him a lot, kind of what they used to do with Vince. I know Vince had some sacks that way, like very similar style of player in that regard, so I could see that being the case. But you hope Alexander comes in, and then I do think Muse has a shot to be kind of like an overhang defender in certain situations. I think he has a shot to be a guy that comes in dime packages and things like that to just help get more athleticism out there. And again, we talked about it last time when we talked about the linebackers. I think Keanu Neal is going to factor into this position too in some way, shape, or form. Like, maybe not as a true linebacker, but he's going to be down in that box area as a coverage player, I think relatively often, especially if either Alexander or especially Roberts, if he is out there is getting abused too often, I do think we'll see Neal come down and maybe help a little bit there too. So I don't know how it's going to work out in the preseason, because I feel like the starters obviously may not play very much. So like the guys who come in might just be just straight up the backups. So you don't really know what to expect there, but I'm hoping it kind of works out the way that I laid out there.
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping it does too, Shayne. I have a roster prediction coming out just before this preseason game,
Right.
and then obviously we'll update that as we go. I think 5 linebackers is the sweet spot here,
Yeah.
and even at those bottom of the roster guys like the Nick Kwiatkowski, who's got over
He's yeah,
2,000 special
he's a
team snaps
veteran.
in his
He's a
career. Like
veteran for
there's
sure.
some value to that because of what he offers on special teams, and then Chappelle Russell's having a good camp as
Yeah,
well, and
I've heard
so
that, yeah.
and so I really think with those final 3 guys, Shayne, it's a 3 dogs in 1 bone situation with Muse being the third of those 3 guys at the bottom there, kind of looking at that position, say,
Yeah.
hey,
He's
we're
been a good
kind of
special
battling
teamer,
each
which
other.
helps him a lot too, so.
So and Muse Muse is the guy I'm polling for because
Yeah.
he is the superior athlete over the other guys, and you hope that maybe he can give you something in coverage that like a Marcus Allen couldn't give you in previous
Right.
years. So
Yeah.
I'll be interested to see how that works. Keep an eye on the linebackers this game on Friday night. Let's talk about DeMarvin Leal real quick. We got 2 more talking points here before we close out today's show. Leal is just that one player I've just been so interested by from day one. Didn't think he was an ideal fit, but obviously has some talent to his game, was a productive player at Texas A&M. So kind of a guy that the Steelers are using a little bit of everywhere. I mean, in training camp so far, he's kind of lined up all over that defensive line, including even on the edge in base defense. And so what I want to see from him in the Steelers versus Bucks game, first of all, when does he come on the field? Is it right away with that first team? Like, is he rotating in the very first third down? Is it not until like the second quarter where you're going to see the guy? I have to imagine you want to deploy some sort of rotation. So fairly early in the game, I would expect to see Leal out there on the field. I know has been dealing with some injuries. So, but the word is that he's healthy enough at this point. How are they going to use the guy? I mean, I want to see what role is best for him. I still kind of am under the belief, Shayne, that it's going to ultimately be like a penetrating interior role, like that 3 technique role. I don't know if he's big enough and stout enough to be that 5 tech 4I, that big base end. And I just don't know if he's athletic enough to be a edge rusher, even in base, unless it's an obvious run-in situation, because anytime you get a guy that runs a 5-second 40 or worse, you're just not going to be quite athletic enough to get there as fast as what an edge defender needs to get to the quarterback. So I'm really interested to see how he's deployed here. Again, the guy was on IR for a good portion of the season last year. Maybe the plan's a little bit different. Maybe that body type is a little bit different now. I'm interested to see what they do.
Yeah, I think he's the guy that has the most intrigue going into the preseason, simply because where is he going to play? What role is he going to have? You talked about when does he come in the game? Is he going to, sub in during the time that the first team defense is still out there? Is he going to show that he's part of a rotation? Like, there's so many question marks with a player that was drafted high enough and is talented enough where you expect certain things from him, but you also don't know what to expect. Is kind of a weird, it's a microcosm of his situation last year, where like he played a lot of roles, he did a lot of things, and just you want to see him just settle into something. Honestly, kind of regardless of what it is. My preference is still either 5 or you said like a 3, one of those 2. But regardless of what it is, I just want to see him settle into it and hopefully get a lot of snaps at whatever position it ends up being.
Yep, I agree. And we'll see how he does in those roles, because I'll be interested to see which one looks best for him. And so that'll be something important to note. All right, one more here, Shayne, as we close up today's show. Steelers versus Buccaneers, first preseason game. I'm interested to see the slot cornerback battle. I mean, this was a question even way back before free agency started.
Yeah.
And Arthur Maulet was under contract for another year. And obviously we know the Steelers ditched Maulet. There was a falling out there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not crying over the loss of Maulet, because I think that Maulet was sort of a big liability in coverage at a lot of times throughout his tenure with the Steelers. At the same time, Shayne, it's like, who is the answer? Like, is it going to legitimately be Patrick Peterson, who hasn't really done this throughout his career? Is it going to be a player like Shannon Sullivan, who's been really disappointing for the Vikings the last 2 years? Are we going to get an outsider like an Elijah Riley or a Duke Dawson, or someone stepping up? Somebody's got to step up and show us that they can handle this role, because a slot cornerback in today's NFL is essentially a starting job. I mean, teams are in nickel more often than not. You have to have a guy that can hold up in coverage there. And so I'm really interested to see between that just huge cluster of players who are each kind of dividing first and second team reps with the Steelers so far in training camp, who ultimately is the guy that's going to show up here.
Yeah, and right now you look at the depth chart, and granted, it's the initial depth chart. It means pretty much nothing. But the 3 names, like you said, Shannon Sullivan, Elijah Riley, Duke Dawson. I really would prefer if it's none of them, unless they really just prove it, right? Like if
Yeah,
someone
yeah.
goes out there and just really shows coverage chops and can fill in the
Mhm.
run game, can crash down from this, like if they can do that, awesome, right? It's just none of those guys have the track record, and the one guy that has the playing time, it wasn't good. So it's
Yeah.
I mean, granted, like Arthur Millette was not great, and we got by with it. So maybe he can at least like if it's Sullivan, maybe he can be just a
Mhm.
hopefully not any worse version of that. But again, the upside is just so small there that you hope that maybe it can be kind of a committee effort. Like maybe in certain passing situations, it is going to be Peterson that moves into the slot. Maybe it's going to be Levi Wallace or whoever. But this position is the one position on the team that is truly open, like wide open, and it is not for a good reason, unfortunately. So you hope that if it is one of these guys, they actually earn it and just aren't just the least bad. That's kind of what you
Yeah,
hope for.
yeah.
But if not, I do hope that, maybe whether it's the waiver wire or whatever else, maybe it's someone comes open that, can fill that role in a better way than what we have right now.
Yeah, the outlook is scary,
Yeah,
Shayne, for some
it's
of the
not
reasons
great.
that you mentioned. Like, we go through these players real quick. Chin and Sullivan, the sample has not been good
Just
these last
bad
couple of
last
years,
year,
and
especially.
he really looked like an unrosterable player in coverage
Yeah,
at times.
yeah.
Duke Dawson, former second round pick, who just flat out failed with the Patriots, couldn't catch on with the Broncos, and now the Steelers have him years later, and it's like, all right, I'm not to say that you can't redeem your career as a football
Like,
player, but
yeah, it's
there's got to
just
be a reason why you just were not catching
yeah,
on anywhere else before.
yeah.
And then Elijah Riley, I mean, is a safety by trade. Can he
Basically,
make
yeah,
that
that's the
transition? And he's of the three, I think that from what I've gathered and from what I witnessed, I think that Riley is probably the most encouraging of that group
yeah.
because he just has not proven it yet, but he hasn't proven that he can do it either. And so
Right.
it's one of those situations where it's like, yeah, you have to see that person step up and say, yes, I'm confident moving forward with this person playing the slot for me, because it is such a big and important role. They don't have a Mike Hilton or a Cameron Sutton like they've had in years past, so guys that are tailor made for that, for covering the slot there. And so be interested to see. And maybe the answer is when the flood of waivers happens, then maybe Steelers put one in for a guy that can play that role. But
Maybe.
it'll be interesting to see, and just keep your eye on that because it's going to affect how the overall performance of the defense this year for sure. All right, I think that's probably enough. Ty, any
Yeah.
other points you want to add for the Steelers preseason game here?
I mean, I will just say from the Bucs side, I'm very curious about the Baker Mayfield or Kyle
Oh,
Trask
yeah.
depth chart designation. That's very interesting to me. Not saying I'm a big fan of Baker Mayfield, but Kyle Trask is not good in my opinion. Never was good, still isn't good. So if he loses that battle, he might want to just find another job. I'm just
I
gonna say
never
that.
understood that hype at Florida. I did not get it. And
He
the people
was
banging the
Kyle
table for the
Pitts made
Steelers to
that
get
man
Trask. No.
millions of dollars, like quite
Yes,
literally.
yes.
That's what
And
happened.
Kadarius Toney with the
Yeah,
run
them
after the
both,
catch ability.
honestly. Yeah.
So
So
yeah, that'll be
yeah.
interesting to see what happens here. Even if the Steelers don't play their starters very long, we've got lots to look forward to.
Yes,
A lot of guys
absolutely.
at the bottom of the roster trying to make a push. And so we'll see what happens on Friday night. Stay with us and we'll bring you the coverage for that. And we'll be back here with the podcast next Wednesday. Thank you for joining us today on the show. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Still Curtain podcast. And thanks for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.